Okay, we're recording,
Yay.
and for those who are just watching the recording, welcome. We have Barrett and Ruth Harley with us discussing their book, Being Interrupted.
So welcome, Al and Ruth, and what we'd like to do is for about the first 25 minutes or so, if you could each introduce yourselves and your book and talk about what inspired you to write it.
Ruth, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ruth Harley, and I am a curate in the Diocese of Oxford. I'm based in Milton Keynes in an ecumenical partnership here. That at the time that we were writing the book, I was an ordinand living in Birmingham, training at the Queen's Foundation, and attached to Hodge Hill Church, where I was working with Al. Al, do you want to do a quick intro, and then we can kick us off on the story of the book?
So my name is Al Barrett. I am a Church of England priest and have just celebrated 20 years being ordained a couple of days ago. Been in Hodge Hill, East Birmingham for 11 years as rector here. And amongst other things, that has involved a journey of joining with our neighbours as well as church members in building community on the Fez and Bromford estate, which is where I live. And I guess the book really emerged from that journey. It has one of its beginnings in the fact that the Church of England church here lost its building about 2 years before I arrived in 2008. And it was a building that had been a thriving centre of community locally. Loads of groups and activities met in the space every week. And when the building was demolished, there was a huge amount of grief and shock and anger. And when I arrived as the new vicar a couple of years later, the question from church members was how do we do church now? How do we do mission? How do we do engagement with our community? And the last 11 years really has been an adventure of beginning to explore some answers to that question. And one of the things that emerged really strongly along the way is how can we as church, where often the dynamics of power and privilege are in our favour, certainly in communities like ours, how can we be radically receptive to the gifts and the challenges of our neighbours in ways that interrupt us, disrupt us, change us, transform us, teach us? And in the midst of that, I did a bit of a PhD, bit of academic work, trying to explore some of those questions. And out the other end of that, wanted to try and do something that was less of an academic project and more of a self-reflective storytelling piece of work, but hopefully something that might resonate with other churches, other Christians in other contexts. And along the way, the questions of race, class and gender became really important lenses through which to see these power relationships with our neighbours and with our fellow Christians. And then a couple more lenses kind of added themselves, and one was the relationship between adults and children, and the other was the relationship between human beings and our fellow creatures, our fellow non-human creature kin. And in the midst of that, conversations, particularly about relationships between adults and children, Ruth and I ended up in a bit of a conversation online before we'd ever met in person. And it became a joint project. Ruth, do you want to say a bit more from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I you know that feeling when you read something, a blog post or an article or a book or whatever, or hear a podcast maybe, and you just go, oh yes, that's the thing I've been thinking, that someone's kind of put it into words that make some sense, and yeah, that's it. So that's the experience I had when I read Al's blog about some of the ideas that eventually became Being Interrupted. So I enthusiastically responded, and we got into this bit of a dialogue, and as a result of that, Al asked me how I would feel about writing a chapter for this book, and I said, yeah, all right then. I did that, and then we got into conversation about some of the other bits of the book, what would become the book. There wasn't a book yet, and more and more we started working together. By that point, we were working together in Hodge Hill as well, so we had that shared context out of which to write. And we started writing some more bits of it together, and eventually it became clear that this was actually a joint project. And actually, I think that's been quite key in that the book, we are very keen that this book is not us saying, here is something, you know, here is how to do it, or here is the way to understand mission, or it's none of those things. The book is a point in a conversation. It's a conversation that was happening way before either of us became part of it. And it's a conversation that we're really excited is ongoing in spaces like this, and undoubtedly elsewhere in ways that we have no idea about. And I think writing it kind of in conversation with each other was quite an important part of the process, and quite important for helping each of us to maybe reflect more sharply on our own situatedness, as we kind of became aware of each other's situatedness, and where the overlaps are and where the differences are, and then where the overlaps and the differences are from others among our neighbours, or among the those whose perspectives we're in dialogue with in the book. Yeah, so it's been a really interesting journey to write in dialogue with each other, but also very much to write in dialogue with our context in Hodge Hill. I think one of the most interesting things for me about writing the book was the extent to which each of us would pick various bits up from different places. There's a lot of WhatsApping went on of, I've just found this thing and I think it might slot in here and maybe it goes with that bit. And some of those sources were things we read or things we heard at conferences or podcasts or whatever, but a lot of them were encounters that we had in our neighbourhood, or things we overheard on the bus, or whatever it might be, and bringing all those bits and pieces into dialogue with each other was a really, really positive process, I think, and yeah, I think that it's interesting. People say, when we say it's a book in dialogue with each other, people often say, well, who wrote which bits then? And the honest answer is, I'm no longer totally 100% sure about some of the bits. But the conversation that we were having between us, that we still are having between us, very much informed the way we wrote. One of our key phrases as we wrote, which you'll hear us use again and again as we talk to each other today, is yes and, which is a very different phrase from yes but. It feels to me. So yes and to me is a phrase of kind of over accepting, of taking whatever it is the other person or the situation you're in is offering and kind of expanding on that and running with it and seeing what creative possibilities it might have. So we had a lot of yes and moments, and one of the joys of talking about the book in a context like this is that we always pick up a few more yes ands from other people along the way. Yes and has definitely been one of our key phrases.
Is it maybe just worth acknowledging that the final chapters of the book were written in the midst of COVID last year? Yeah, certainly the chapters on Cross and Resurrection had no sense of shape and direction to them until about April or May last year. And so right in the middle of a global pandemic and all the ways in which it was unequally experienced, in our society and in our neighbourhoods and in our world, in the midst of the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement, post the killing of George Floyd, in the midst of the Church of England wrestling with questions of institutional racism, with a focus that it hadn't really until last year. A whole load of stuff was the context for those final chapters of the book, and I think there was a sense in which it was only through our conversations together that we were able to discern a kind of direction of travel to where it ended up. And one of the things, I guess, that has a certain distinctiveness to what we've wanted to say is that more triumphalistic proclamations of resurrection and of hope and of reconciliation and of all those sort of very positive Christian words that we often use quite readily. Actually, we were wanting to be much more tentative and subtle and cautious about, but in a way, hopefully, that actually enables us to talk about hope and resurrection and transformation in ways that actually do more justice to the lived reality, both for ourselves but also for our neighbours.
Yeah, and I think also wanting to leave a sort of sense of open-endedness. We very much didn't want to arrive at the end of the book in a kind of, so that's that sewn up and here's a kind of proposition. It's not a propositional kind of a book in that sense. We're wanting to leave it open to the next bit of conversation, the next yes and, the next interruption, wherever that may come from. I noticed in the chat we've got a great question from Davey. Thanks, Davey. Did you choose the title before or after lockdown? Before. Yes, we had chosen the title quite some time before, in fact. And the irony of having to email your publisher to say that the manuscript for the book entitled Being Interrupted will be late because you have in fact been interrupted by a pandemic was not lost on us.
And we had a little bit of wrestling, didn't we, about how do we do justice to COVID when we pretty much finished the book, because in some ways, one option was that we completely rewrite it in the context of what we've ended up calling the great interruption of COVID, and we make that the sort of central focus and frame of it. And to be honest, I think both of us were exhausted and overwhelmed by life in a way that completely rewriting it just wasn't an option. But what we did want to do is find some way of reflecting on that great interruption. So actually the epilogue to the book is a conversation that Ruth and I had on Zoom, a bit like this. Kind of we'd had some email exchanges in the weeks before as we'd begun to put it together to make some sense of what the particular nuances of COVID had done to our theme. But yeah, it was a conversation like this which Ruth then amazingly transcribed from Zoom onto paper for us as you said, Ruth, a deliberately open-ended kind of, this is where we're at this stage of a global pandemic, and who knows what tomorrow might bring, but this is what being interrupted feels right now.
Yeah, and I think probably if even the two of us have that similar conversation again now, or even just a couple of months after we actually had it would be a very different conversation in some ways. I mean, some of the same themes would be there, I think, but it would be very different. And life is just changing fast, isn't it? And I think we wanted to acknowledge that reality and not kind of second guess where we might be going next or what interruptions might be coming our way.
Faith, how's that as a starting point? Oh, you're unmuted.
Helps if I unmute myself. Yeah, I think that's great. And I have all kinds of thoughts and questions, but I'm the chair and I'm supposed to be leading the discussion. So I just want to open it up to those of us gathered here, and we're going to have a time of feedback and questions. So the first one is for those who have read the book, what did you learn about it from your first reading? And I guess if you've been voracious enough to read it a second time, maybe the second. And what are you hoping to get out of this discussion with Alan Ruth? And if it's something that you'd rather not say aloud, you can type in the chat. We already had a question come through the chat that Ruth addressed, so thanks. So just anyone, and if you haven't read the book, you can comment too about what you're curious about. So go ahead. Anyone want to go first? Well, while people are kind of collecting their thoughts, something that that really resonated with me, Ruth, was when you talked about this not being sewn up and leaving it very open-ended. And what it made me think of was like I grew up in a tradition that was very much about testimony and sharing testimony, but they always felt like completed testimonies, you know, like this is where I was, this is where I am now, and, you know, now we're all good. And so like what I appreciate, and I guess maybe would want to hear more about, is if we're focusing always on like these completed testimonies or completed stories, who all is getting cut out of those conversations, and how you address that, or if that was in your mind when you were writing the book. So if anyone else has a question, you can also jump in, but if you'd like to start there, maybe we can start there.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, I think Al mentioned as well that storytelling is a really important part of the way the book has worked for us. Storytelling is a really important part of life together at Hodge Hill as well. And the stories, we felt it was really important to intersperse stories through the book. So there are stories of local life all the way through the book, as well as stories from scripture. And yeah, it is it's a very different storytelling approach from that sort of testimony approach that you're describing, Faith. I think what we were really conscious to not want to do is we really didn't want to try and fit anybody's story, including our own, into a sort of preconceived narrative arc of, well, it's got to kind of have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and at the end has got to be that it's okay because God has made it okay, and it's because I'm not sure any of us actually experience life quite that neatly, but certainly that's often a narrative that is more possible to map onto the stories of those with more privilege. And I think also just wanting to acknowledge that the ambiguities with which we live, and that those ambiguities and diversities and differences are not something that needs to be overcome in order to get to that sort of neat narrative arc ending, but that's actually where the richness of life is. And one of the ways that we express that in the book, I think, is through our work around ecotones. So ecotones in the natural world are those spaces where two habitats meet, so like a shoreline or where a forest meets a field, or those kinds of spaces. And they're incredibly rich. The biodiversity there is extraordinary. And I think one of the things we wanted to do with the way that we tell stories is leave spaces that are like those ecotone spaces that aren't a neat edge or a neat ending, but have a sort of, a rich and ambiguous space full of life, but not necessarily life in a kind of neatly ordered way, because life just isn't, is it?
I think there are various ways in which we try to embody that different kind of storytelling in practice in Hodghill as well. So I'm a big fan of consensus decision making, and really not a fan of authoritarian decision making and acting. But one of the few authoritarian decisions I made shortly after arriving Hodghill was ripping down a poster that was at the back of church, and I can't remember the exact wording, but it was roughly along the lines of "Before I met Jesus, sad face; after I met Jesus, happy face." And I just, there was so much that was not true about it that I quietly just sort of tore it down while no one was looking, and hoped no one would notice, and I don't think they did. But one of the things that we've tried to do over the years in our gatherings for worship is give people space to say something about the experience they're bringing with them. And one of our habits is what we call fifth gospels. So that sense that there are 4 gospels written down in the Bible, but the fifth gospel is still being lived by all of us. And really, it's as simple as inviting a member of the congregation to say, where have you encountered God present or at work in the last week or month or year? But really trying to encourage people not to tell a sort of happy end, or not to feel the pressure to tell a happy ending story, a story that finishes, a story that, can be full of wonderings and questions still. A kind of, could it be? Maybe, I'm not sure. Yeah, but I think God might be. And that possibility of telling a story about where God feels absent as much as where God feels present. And I think that makes a difference to how a community gathers and worships if you encourage a culture that tells those kind of open-ended stories. And I think we've certainly noticed a kind of subtle change in the way we talk about God and the way we talk about our lives because of that.
I keep
you're on mute again.
Sorry. We have a question in the chat, and then I think Henriette had a hand up. So let's go to the question that was in the chat, and then we'll get to Henriette. So someone asked, do you think the quote unquote great interruption will invoke permanent change in the sense of the ecotones of church landscape in the UK have been profoundly disrupted? Is this something to, in your opinion, be welcomed? Oh, I like that phrasing. What do you all think?
Shall I kick up on that one? So I think for me, it's a yes and a no. And the yes and no is to do with what certainly in the book we've observed about how human beings generally deal with interruptions. Because it's possible to deal with an interruption by digging deeper into the trenches in which you already find yourself, or to use another metaphor, kind of building the walls that defend your territory higher than they were before. And I think we don't need to look far to see plenty of examples of that kind of response to challenge and disruption. And certainly, I think one of the things that we noticed, again, when we were reflecting in the early days of COVID about church life, is that while in some ways it looked like it was being radically reinvented, in other ways, what COVID revealed, in that kind of apocalyptic sense of the word, apocalypse is something that is kind of exposed, revealed. What it revealed is actually some of the root assumptions about what church is about, or what is most important about church. And in many ways, we as churches kind of doubled down on the thing that we thought was most important about church. So, for example, and this is slightly crude, but for example, if the most important thing about church was people coming to consume and experience, then that was what those churches did more of, but they just did it online rather than in person. If the most important thing about church was a space for people to engage in conversation with each other, then that was the thing that churches tried to do more of. So I think, I mean, there are examples of the no to your question, Martin, I guess. I think there are all kinds of examples of the yes that we're still seeing unfolding, and I guess one of those for kind of close to home for us was about seeing the amazing bubbling up of compassion and creativity among our neighbours, and actually identifying, seeing God at work in places well beyond the walls of church, seeing the Holy Spirit connecting people together, and outbreaks of mutual love and care and support. And actually, where churches have recognised that going on beyond their own projects and initiatives and territory, actually, that I think has possibly unleashed new possibilities. But Ruth, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with all of that. I think my yes and here would be, I think my basic answer to Martin's question is probably, I think it's too soon to know yet. I think we're still in the very early days of finding out the answer to that question, or the answers probably multiple. One of the things that I've been wondering about is the extent to which being outside more, many of us have been outdoors more than we would normally have been, because outdoors has been the safe space in which to connect with people. And whether or not that was our intention, I think one of the things that's done is sort of alter our relationship with our non-human neighbours. It's altered our relationship with the environment around us in all sorts of interesting and subtle ways. I feel like I'm noticing more wording or imagery that draws on encounter with the other in the environment. I'm noticing more of that creeping into people's preaching and ways of speaking and understandings and metaphors, which I think is really interesting. I wonder what that will do for us long term. I don't think that's going to suddenly radically change how we're doing church in most instances, but I wonder whether it is a little shift that's going to work its way through. And I suspect there are other sort of shifts in relationship or shifts in understanding that might work themselves out in quite a long-term sort of way, and we might not be able to pinpoint, oh yeah, that's because of that thing that happens during that great interruption of COVID. Yeah, I don't know. I think I think I'm less sure about how that's going to play out than I maybe was when we recorded the epilogues sort of over a year ago. Where I think I was more confident about what we were observing, and now I just don't know. Which leaves space for all sorts of interesting yes ands for potentially years to come. So we'll see, but it's a great question to keep on our radar, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, Henriette, did you have a question, thought, comment?
Thank you. Yes, first of all, I just want to thank you, Ruth and Al, for writing the book. I found it the most profound book, and I recognized so much in it because, as you probably can hear, I am an immigrant. I'm also a woman, and for most of my son's life, I have been a lone parent. So there were lots of things in that book that just made some pieces fall into place in my life, thinking, oh, this is why that happens. And this is why I get so frustrated about certain situations. But of course, on the other hand, I'm also a very privileged person who grew up in the Netherlands, and I'm white. So there is that chafing of the two against each other. So I have found it such a helpful book to read. I haven't completely finished it yet. But one of the things that really struck me was when you were writing about wilding. And, you know, it is when you start talking about these ecosystems and, you know, to just let a place wild and just, and I thought, that is just such a great idea, especially now, where we are at now, in churches and places like that. And then immediately I realized that there is a lot of wanting to cultivate back to how it was before. So I was wondering if you can say something about how we can help ourselves and others to actually allow that wilding to happen.
Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic question. Yeah, the kind of wilding metaphor, that metaphor of it's a metaphor of letting go of control, really, or rather, we're actually really careful about how we speak about this. It's not letting go of control, it's letting go of the illusion of control. Because actually we're not really in control in the first place. We just like to think we are. But letting go of that desire to be in control, letting things spring up in exciting and challenging and strange and disruptive ways. I think it's all of us, I think, have somewhere in us that desire to get a grip on something, to hold on to it, to keep control, to be kind of steering something. And it's a continual letting go and letting go again. And for me personally, one of the things that I find really helpful in that, whether it's literally with my, I have to say, quite wild garden, or metaphorically with the church, is really consciously asking myself, well, what is beautiful here? What are those strange things? But what also are the things that I don't know what they are yet? So I moved house in the summer. I've got a lot of things in my garden that I don't know what they are yet. It may or may not become clear. But similarly, in a church, letting things grow in their own time and saying, well, I've noticed this, and I don't really know what it is yet, but I'm just gonna let it be for a bit and see what it turns out to be, and what that where we might be going with that. I think because it is quite hard not to revert back to wanting to be in control of stuff, I think one of the things that I've found really helpful is doing that with somebody else. We're back to that dialogue thing again, because there's a little bit of accountability of being able to say to one another, have you noticed that you're sort of managing that situation in a way that maybe you don't need to be? Or because often we just don't notice we're doing it. Particularly those of us who, for whatever reasons of privilege that we might have, are used to our way of doing things being the way of doing things. It's just noticing when we're doing that, when we're slipping back into that and saying, well, hang on a minute, what's the alternative here? What else can we do? Al, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, Ruth, I was struck by your phrase about noticing what's beautiful. And I love that as one of the ways of kind of shaping this approach. And I think I wanted to say a yes and to your sense of kind of doing that in dialogue with others, because I guess one of the things that shapes our tendency to want to cultivate things is our particular perception of what counts as beautiful. And actually, you know, when we talk to others and when we listen to others about actually what are you noticing here? What for you is beautiful in this situation? Actually, we often find ourselves surprised. You know, it's a bit like our different responses to a work of art or something, that for some people it might be hideous, but for others it kind of is life-changing. And I think one of the things, so our description of wilding is rooted in a book by the wonderfully named Isabella Tree, and the book's called Wilding, and it's the story of her and her husband changing their approach to a large amount of farmland in Sussex. And one of the places where they hit the most conflict with neighbours and with authorities and with people passing through was that some of it actually started looking really messy and ugly, and also involved leaving, for example, animal carcasses to die and decompose in the space that they were responsible for, rather than, you know, the normal approach in farming is that if an animal is sick, you take it to an abattoir and get it kind of clinically killed and disposed of. And while that's quite a gruesome image, actually it reminds us that the ecology within which we live depends on death and decomposition as part of those cycles of growth and life and development. And I think it really struck us as we wrote the book that often the church, although our story is rooted in a story of a death, actually is really scared of embracing dying and death and decomposition. You know, we have this narrative so often of focusing on growth, of healthy churches and kind of, you know, building up the sides of the barrel that are looking a bit leaky, and all those images that are about sort of shoring up and defending and sort of focusing on the ways in which the machine and the communities and the individuals within it can be resilient. But actually we're much less good at acknowledging that the places where we're fragile, the places where we've lost or are losing, the places where things are dying and actually are unsightly and ugly and all the rest of it, are precisely also places within the ecosystem where life is happening and where life is springing up and where God is present. And I think trying to find a way of thinking about life that pays attention to those places and those processes just feels so important for us as a church and as a human community at this point.
Yeah, and I think that's a really helpful yes and I think my next yes ands to that would be where the church does speak about death, we're very often speaking about it as a prelude to resurrection, which of course, you know, is the narrative of our faith. But sometimes we're in a hurry to get there. And actually there's something, so one of the big influences on both of us is Shelley Rambo's work around sitting in the Holy Saturday space, you know, with that space between death and resurrection. And I think that's one of the things that I find, so one of the metaphors that we use towards the end of the book is about decomposition. And decomposition as a source of life, as a source of resurrection, sort of resurrection from the compost heap. I think decomposition is a really helpful kind of a metaphor, because it's a slow process and it's not a neat, tidy, again, we're back to what Faith was saying earlier about those testimony stories that have a happy ending. And I think the temptation to use death or loss as the setup for a happy ending is one to be really, really strongly resisted, because it doesn't do justice either to that sense of death and loss, or actually to that sense of the possibilities of resurrection hope. I think engaging with the complexity of that and engaging with the sort of the long-term nature of decomposition as a metaphor, I've found that a really helpful and kind of life-giving, which is what decomposition is ultimately. It's a life-giving thing, but not life-giving in that kind of triumphalist way. When my compost heap decomposes and produces something which will make my vegetables grow, that's not a victory over death. That's acknowledging that death and decay and decomposition are in themselves life-giving and part of a cycle of death and resurrection, growth and decay. I find those metaphors really helpful, and also really helpful in enabling us to be less anxious. So one of the things that we identify strongly in the book is the Church of England, which is our own location. We don't want to try and speak for anywhere that we are not located, but the Church of England certainly as a very institutionally anxious church. And I don't think it is actually just the Church of England, but that kind of institutional anxiety about the future, about how do we keep growing, about all those sorts of things. I think embracing decomposition as a metaphor has helped me to resist some of that anxiety, certainly, and I hope it helps others.
Thanks. And I just want to acknowledge I sort of jumped straight into Q&A, and which is fine. We're getting some great questions here. We got another one from Davey. What would be good ways to live out an interrupted approach to our Muslim friends and neighbors of other faiths? And as you're thinking about and answering that question, I'm thinking maybe for the next 10 until about 11, if you could maybe be looking at this question and maybe then get a chance to maybe draw out a theme from the book that you'd like to discuss more. And then maybe we can take a 5-minute body break if folks are okay with that before we go to half 2.
Davey, that's a great question. Thank you, and certainly one that's live for us in Hodge Hill. About 50% of our parish is Muslim locally. So when we talk about engaging with our neighbours here, we're often talking about engaging with our Muslim neighbours. One of the stories we tell in the book is of our Street Nativity, which has become an annual tradition here, certainly when we're able to, where both the cute children but also the much less cute adults dress up and tell the story of Christmas, but walking through a number of locations around our estate, and the locations tend to change from year to year. And one year we got to the last but one stage of our journey, and we persuaded Sonny, who I think would describe himself as a lapsed Muslim, who runs the local chip shop. And Sonny we'd persuaded to be King Herod, and he delivered his line to the 3 wise men, I think 2/3 of whom were women. Then Sonny kind of stripped off his crown and his robe and said, right, everybody into the chip shop, free fish and chips all around. At which point I'm hastily on the phone to the folk up at church who were supposed to be the last stop of the journey, who were going to be providing sort of mulled wine and mince pies, and we were going to end with carols and all the rest of it, saying we're going to be a bit later and people aren't going to be as hungry as we thought they were. But Sonny wanted to kind of offer that hospitality and that generosity, and it was a no-brainer that the response to that was, of course we're going to stay, and of course we're going to let the agenda go and let this be the place where we receive. And I think probably that's been one of our learnings locally, is that while we as Christians, I think on the whole, love to offer hospitality and to host things and to be generous and kind to our neighbours. And there's of course nothing wrong with that at all. It's also important, and particularly important when the power relationships are often skewed towards us. It's also important to find ways of saying yes to the invitations from our neighbours, to receive hospitality and generosity and gifts from them. And I think for me, and to give you a brief example of something that happened last year in the midst of COVID lockdown, that has been particularly important with our Muslim neighbours in ways in which they want to offer not just gifts of hospitality, of food and friendship and welcome, but also gifts that are firmly and explicitly rooted in their faith tradition. So last year, a group of us Christians with some of our Muslim friends fasted for a day during Ramadan. And, you know, I'll be honest, as a Christian fasting for a day that felt really hard work, just feel a little bit pathetic in comparison to our Muslim neighbours who are in the middle of fasting for a whole month, you know. But during the day, as we fasted and as we communicated with each other via WhatsApp, our Muslim neighbours were offering us encouragement, were offering us kind of hints and tips on how to cope and how to fast through the day. And were offering us prayers from their tradition, which I think without exception, I was able to accept as a prayer for me, a prayer that my Muslim friends prayed for me, but also sometimes within the day as a prayer that I could quite happily pray with integrity myself. And then at the end of the day, when we broke our fast and we all took responsibility for cooking different bits of the meal and then dropping stuff on each other's doorsteps, when we broke our fast together via Zoom, a bit like we're doing now, but with food in front of us, and one of our Muslim neighbours led us in a blessing. It was the most profoundly enriching, stretching, challenging, transformative experience. And that, you know, it doesn't preclude us offering similar gifts from our own tradition into those conversations as Christians, but also I think, you know, we as Christians have been much less practiced at receiving the gifts that our neighbours of other faiths want to offer us.
Yeah, I think all of that is really helpful, and I think one of the things for me that a sort of being interrupted type of approach allows in terms of relationship with neighbours of other faiths is a kind of, it's back to this thing of being non-anxious again. It's a non-anxious curiosity. That approaching people without an agenda, without a sort of goal in mind, allows us to let go of some of that need to kind of cultivate or be in control that we were discussing earlier, and then allows relationship to flourish on its own terms, which I think is enormously helpful. So there are, of course, a lot of different approaches that we could have taken to talking in the book and beyond about inclusion and diversity. And I think one of the really important things for me, which we don't actually articulate in the book, but it certainly underlies my approach, is what Carter Hayward, the American theologian, names as the hermeneutic of particularity, by which she means that our approach to welcoming and embracing a diversity of neighbours is rooted in an emphasis on our particularity alongside our commonality. So rather than saying, oh, isn't it great that we're all basically the same, saying instead, isn't it a gift that we are not all the same? that we have these particularities, and being attentive to that. And actually, I think one of the things that we do talk about in the book is that the kind of "isn't it great that we're all the same" approach is a form of obliviousness that's actually only open to those of us with a level of privilege. We're not all the same. We're not all in the same boat. That was one of the things COVID really revealed, wasn't it? We might all be in the same storm, but we are not all in the same boat. And actually, it's only the attentiveness to people's particularity that enables us to start to address some of those divisions and oppressions and marginalizations. And I think the way that plays out with our neighbours of other faiths is in saying, yeah, we have got a lot in common, but actually let's be attentive to our particularity. Let's be attentive to one another's traditions and understandings of the world, not in order to try and kind of smooth out the differences between us, but in order to kind of draw out how those particularities offer gifts among us. There will be gifts that we receive from the particularity of our Muslim neighbours' faith, and I hope there will be gifts that they receive from the particularity of our faith, without needing to change each other or pretend we're more similar than we are. I think it's an approach that's actually embodied really well in scriptural reasoning. For those who've come across that idea of reading one another's sacred texts together is a real attentiveness to particularity. But that's kind of also, it's not just about texts, as it is, it's how we read one another's lives. Yeah, with attentiveness to particularity that I think often leads to attentiveness to what we see of God in each other and in our encounters with the other. I mean, obviously that doesn't just apply to our neighbours of other faiths, that applies to all of our others in whatever different way, but hopefully that might go some way to addressing that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was really beautifully put. Again, I have many thoughts, but I'm thinking this might be a good time for us to kind of take about a 5-minute break. I'm seeing it's 10:58 now. Maybe we'll reconvene at 11:03, and at that point, it might be like if Ruth and Al can be thinking of like good questions to pose to the group for a bit of discussion, that'd be great. So I'll see you all in 5 minutes. Okay, so as people are kind of filtering back from our break, let's kind of move into the next section now. So Alan, Ruth, do you have thoughts on a question you might pose to the group? People who want to respond, you can go ahead and raise your hand if you want to say it aloud, or just you can pop something in the chat and I will read it.
So the bizarre thing about Zoom is that in that 5-minute break, we'd normally be sort of in a corner somewhere having a chat about this over a cup of tea, but we've just been messaging each other. And I think something along the lines of where have the themes that we've been exploring resonated with your own experiences? And what resources have you found helpful to draw on in those situations? So we'd love, as Ruth said earlier, we'd love for this conversation to sort of extend and stretch beyond what we've said and written. We'd love to hear where it resonates for you, and what other resources, whether from scripture or theology or from other aspects of life, that you found helpful in those places.
And I think a reminder just that, as we were saying earlier, the open-ended, the unfinished, the I wonder, the tentative, the I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this is all an extremely welcome form of storytelling and exploration, and very much our normal mode of operating, to be honest. So don't feel held back by not being quite sure where your experience goes or how it might fit. Feel free to share whatever you would like.
Well, I guess one of the things, this might feel like a little bit of pushback, but I'm wondering if this has to do with things from different backgrounds. But I will say that as my personal observation, coming as someone from a more working class background, I don't know. I grew up with people who were, I don't know, there really was kind of this sense of the Christian faith really being this story of hope, you know, and there being a more concrete embrace of, you know, the resurrection in very concrete ways, like, you know, my mother suffered for many years, but we will be together again. And I guess maybe one of the things that I struggle with is acknowledging the dangers of a triumphalistic Christianity, while also acknowledging that, wondering maybe if in some cases the, I don't know, maybe more intellectualist, meandering approach just might feel more native to people who come from maybe a more middle class background. And again, that might feel like pushback, but I'm just curious about other people's thoughts on that, maybe.
Shall I throw something in there? Yeah, I think that is one of the tensions that is around in this kind of work is yeah. And I think for me it's connected to a question about what kind of hope are we offering, and how do we tread that fine line between saying absolutely there is hope to be found in the resurrection, absolutely there is, but what kind of hope is that? So not tripping over into that kind of, well, it'll all be all right kind of hope, which actually I think does down the hope that we are offered in the resurrection, which is a deeper kind of hope. I think, yeah, I mean, I too come from a very working class background, although I don't sound like it these days, but which is a whole other story in itself. But I think one of the things I have been challenged about in my time at Hodge Hill is my own assumption that somehow the kind of more open-ended approach was a more intellectual approach, or was more suited to people with a certain degree of privilege or whatever, and that's just been completely blown out of the water for me by my experience and encounter with Hodge Hill. I think my favourite example of this is the kind of well, Al, you should tell the story, but the kind of Easter Eve sort of stories of loss and of hope, kind of that storytelling for me really captures. Do you want to tell the story, Al, so people can get a sense of how that is, and the sort of open-endedness that there is in that? That's not a kind of intellectual thing at all, really.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, this kind of intellectually links back to what Ruth was saying earlier about Shelley Rambo's work and Holy Saturday space being that kind of the space to spend longer time in. And certainly for about 10 years now, we've had the tradition on Easter Eve, rather than a sort of big, grand, ritualized service in church, very small, minimal structure, gathering in an open space somewhere around a fire, sharing our stories of loss and grief, and of what another trauma theorist, Serene Jones, calls hope deferred. That sense of kind of, I am longing to find hope in this situation, but it's not yet come. And those gatherings have been profound in the level of openness and fragility, but also, as Ruth says, kind of a different kind of hopefulness has been shared in those stories. And strangely, one of the earliest gatherings happened in the only just cooled ashes of a climbing frame that had been set fire to in one of our local parks just weeks after the council had installed new play equipment, and everybody was kind of celebrating, but actually it was the wrong thing in the wrong place, and the council hadn't really listened to local residents and what was most appropriate. In the midst of those ashes, we sat and shared our stories. But also we had a few young people kind of come over to us and ask us what we were doing, and we kind of explained, and they saw our seed bombs that we'd made in the days before, and they said, what are they? And we told them what a seed bomb was, and they said, oh, how much do you want for them? And we said, no, you can have some, take them away. And the thing about seed bombs is that you chuck them anywhere and you don't necessarily know what grows, but the hope is in the throwing. And I think for us locally, sorry, this is a bit of a roundabout way of answering your question, Faith. For us locally, one of the things that's really important is the distinction that Anne Morrissey makes in her work between proclaimed hope and enacted hope. Proclaimed hope is kind of telling people that, things are going to get better at some point, things are going to be all right. Enacted hope is kind of when you can touch it and feel it and taste it and smell it. And much of what we've done locally has been working with our neighbours to nurture often fragile examples of enacted hope, where you can actually go somewhere and feel it. And I think, in many ways, more traditional and even conservative church communities, alongside their proclamations of hope, in one way or another, they seek to enact it as well, to make it feel real now. But I think what we would probably want to just invite people to pay more attention to is precisely what, how is it enacted in practice? And does it do justice to the whole breadth of life experience, including death and including fear and anxiety and whatever? Or does it kind of close off some areas and say, you're not allowed to talk about that, or you're not allowed to feel that, or that, that way of telling the story is not okay? And I think, what we're falteringly trying to articulate and get at is how might those spaces of enacted hope, inclusive enacted hope, be nurtured?
And I think that's one of the other key questions for me, as well as sort of how is it enacted? By whom is hope enacted? And I think one of the temptations for particularly for church leaders that we address in the book is around wanting to be the provider. And I think one of the ways that we are often tempted into that is wanting to be the provider of hope. And we absolutely cannot be, because that's Jesus, and we are not Jesus. But also understanding that where we are enacting hope, it needs to be done communally. It's not something that you can enact for somebody else. There's something there. I've just said, oh, it's Jesus, but there's something there about what it means to be the body of Christ and what it means to be an enacting body. that I think is really well worth reflecting on. But there is something really important about hope not just being some sort of thing that we talk about, but something that is experienced in some way, but in acknowledging that those experiences are always going to be incomplete in some sense.
Yeah, thank you for taking on a reflection that might have come out a little more provocative than I intended. There's also Danielle has posted, I was thinking about as a church leader, getting the balance of creating space for wilding while also making things accessible and inclusive can be a challenge or a balancing act. I'm thinking of people who have experienced trauma or who are neurodiverse or may struggle with a lack of clarity for any number of reasons. In our church, we talk a lot about being a learning community while also documenting what is happening and changes for those. It says who just need a bit, I'm guessing you meant warming there, a bit of warming.
I meant warning.
Oh, a bit of warning. You did mean warning. Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to clarify that. So do need some warning. Okay. And then we also have a comment here from John on being more deeply rooted in nature. Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, botanist and Native American traditioner, bestseller in the US, weaves in lots of open-ended stories. I'm wondering if there are British books that combine nature, science, spirit, and attention to healing social trauma. And wondered if you all might have thoughts on that. Or anything you want to jump in there with.
I'm just, yeah, go on, go for it. I'm typing a book suggestion in the chat and I can't multitask. Go for it, Hal.
If I pick up one thought I had on the second one before going back to Danielle's. So Alistair McIntosh is, and I think, you've had him in one of these sessions, haven't you?
Yeah. He and Matt Carmichael came and talked about, oh gosh, now I've lost the name of the book. Spiritual, activism, that's it.
Sure. So he talks about soil, soul, and society as three dimensions in which we encounter God, and his stuff is profoundly rooted both in the kind of the physical landscape in which he inhabits and walks, but also in deep faith traditions. One of the things that one of the more provocative pieces that I read of his about a year ago reflected on Donald Trump's ancestry in the Scottish Islands, and particularly in the experience of clearance, that movement from kind of the Scottish elite or the British elite, that literally cleared people off the land that they'd worked for centuries and that was their livelihoods, and that, coincidentally or not, was kind of entwined with a more black and white form of Presbyterian Christianity. And Alistair McIntosh reflected on how much that kind of historic trauma within Donald Trump's family may have been one of the contributing factors to the kind of person and politics that he embodied, which was fascinating. But yeah, I definitely recommend his stuff. And Ruth, you've got one as well?
Yep, I've just typed into the chat that sort of reflection of kind of I mean, it's very, very different from Robin Wall Kimmerer. I love Raising Sweetgrass, and that fantastic one she wrote about moths that I've forgotten the title of, but it's got the word moths in it. But Alice Fowler, who is a Birmingham-based, or was at the time at least, Birmingham-based writer, who writes a fantastic book called Hidden Nature, in which she kayaks all of the canals in Birmingham. Yes, and she reflects on. It's a sort of, she's in quite a life crisis moment of her own, and there's a really intertwined reflection of kind of natural environment and built environment and self and other people's interpretation of who she is and who she is discovering herself to be, and sort of wider societal themes. It's a really hard to kind of quantify book, but it's a really interesting, it's a good read. And for those of you who are Birmingham based, you'll recognise bits of it as you read it, which is lovely. I just, can we return just for a minute to Danielle's question about the balancing act between, so definitely that balancing act, I think, is something that Al and I would both resonate with. We are quite similar to each other in some senses in our sort of leadership approach, which we have often characterised as a kind of faithful improvisation, otherwise known as we weren't quite sure what we were doing this morning, but we've kind of made it up as we went along and it seems to have been all right. That's most mornings that we work together. But we are, I certainly am very aware that for some people that offers really creative space, and for some people that's quite a challenging thing to encounter. There's definitely that tension there. And I guess, again, this is back to that attentiveness to particularity, isn't it? To sort of the particularity of our own situations and the people within them. And I suppose I would hope that if we're being attentive enough to the particularity of our neighbours and the people that we're working with and worshipping with and doing life with, that includes incorporating an attentiveness to people's various needs for either open-endedness or a more clear structure or whatever it might be, and includes a co-creation of that with our neighbours. So necessarily, if the community that you are part of, there are also part of people who are part of that community who have a need for structure, then what you co-create together will have some structure to it, and should have. And how it's like any community thing, isn't it? How you hold different people's needs in tension. And I guess I'd want to say intention in a way that manages to be more creative than seeing them in conflict with each other. I think it's as soon as we start seeing needs as conflicting rather than sort of that as a creative tension that we run into difficulties. And that kind of idea, one of the things we talk about in the book is this idea of abundance versus scarcity. So often we live, including in the church, we live in a culture that is built on an assumption of scarcity. And in that assumption of scarcity, then different people's needs or preferences or whatever it might be can really easily be seen as being in conflict with each other. Whereas if we allow ourselves to operate on an assumption of abundance, then it reframes how we see those tensions a bit, I think.
And I think I wanted to add a positive word about boundaries here as well. That, Ruth and I in our writing have talked quite a lot about ecotones and that sense of the messy edges between and the ways in which they can be hugely generative and kind of sources of abundance. But I think also there's a bit of a kind of meanwhile important need for firmer boundaries and particularly around the exercise of power. So one of the things that I would want to acknowledge and has been a real journey of learning and articulating with more clarity over the course of writing the book with Ruth is the way in which those of us that have multiple layers of structural privilege have a tendency to fill spaces. And that, that's about talking more. That's about kind of, that awful habit of manspreading. It's about filling space in all kinds of different ways, but actually, particularly for those of us with multiple layers of power and privilege, learning to live within boundaries that are smaller than we have been taught to imagine they should be can be a profoundly life nurturing practice, both for ourselves but also for those around us. And so, you know, learning when to stop, learning when to say or to hear a no, learning when it's not our place to have the first word or the last word in a conversation, but also learning where actually a bit of structure helps in those processes and those negotiations. You know, all of that stuff feels profoundly important within this.
Yeah, and articulating clearly those boundaries and sort of the reasoning behind them. I think, you know, the flip side of that, learning to take up less space, is for those of us who don't share all of those privileges, although I share many of those privileges, learning to take up more space sometimes. And for those of us who live at a kind of intersection of some layers of privilege and some layers of lack of privilege, learning to discern when are the times we need to take up more space and when are the times we need to take up less space. That's quite hard work, and it's quite nuanced. And again, it's that thing of attentiveness to particularity of the situation. But one of my favourite examples of a really clear, really simple but really clear bit of boundary setting in order to kind of rebalance how space is distributed and how attention is distributed. I was at a lecture a few years ago where the lecturer, who was male, had spoken, and the person chairing the lecture, who was both female but also a very committed feminist, she asked for questions from the floor, and after a few questions, she just said very simply, the first 3 questions have been from men. I will take the next 3 questions from women. And immediately, the hands of women who had not had their hands up before went up all around the hall. And that's the kind of boundary and structure that can be really, that actually creates a space where interruption and disruption is possible. That's that kind of creative tension of, yes, these things are in tension, but they're not in conflict, or not necessarily. That kind of holding of space, I think, and that naming of privilege, because one of the things we talk about in the book a lot is obliviousness, and that one of the features of privilege is that you cannot know it's there. Whereas the people on the flip side of that dynamic very much know it's there. Yeah, I think that kind of structured naming and holding of space to reverse that kind of flow of privilege and power is a really interesting phenomenon, and doesn't need to be a massive big thing. It can just be something really simple like that.
Yeah, I really loved your distinction there between intention and in conflict. And so that just reframes for me so much about what you understand possibilities to be, like in bringing life and working with spirit. I just want to point out a couple things I'm seeing in the chat here. First of all, Al, you recommended Anita Sadie's book, I Belong Here. Yeah, Macintosh is brilliant, just from what I've seen of him, John. Faithful Improvisation, and yeah, and I think I saw someone had a hand up. Who had their hand up? Was that you, Jody? Yeah, go ahead.
I have my hand up now, even with the special thing. Yeah, I think one of the things that I found really resonant was that idea of, I mean, specifically the Church of England, because that's also where I'm located, being a very anxious place. And actually, even something that almost seems kind of built into its DNA, because kind of even looking back to kind of stuff from the time of like the Victorian period, during the sort of Enlightenment, when science was on the rise, there were all these things from church leaders thinking, oh no, science is going to destroy us. And yet that was kind of over 100 years ago. So there's almost something about it being built into our DNA, but also the way that that anxiety and the kind of position of power that the Church of England kind of holds, almost being kind of symbiotic, maybe, because they kind of feed off one another. And the more anxious we get, the more we want to hold on to our power. And none of that seems very helpful. And I've also definitely noticed just there's a lot of anxiety about, and I've kind of, I mean, on one level, there's sort of very real concerns about kind of being able to afford the maintenance of churches, and making sure you're able to do things well does require a level of resource. But at the same time, I think I've generally not got that much time for being worried about stuff, because I think I'd rather get on and be the church. And I think there's, so I think you do a good job of subverting that. And I think I also think that the wilding stuff is really resonant and interesting, and it really, you can't be anxious while you're doing it, because you kind of have to you have to sort of just let it, you don't really know what's going to happen. And that letting go of power can feel like quite a difficult thing to do. And there's something about the being able to let go of power, or to subvert the structures of power when other people expect you to maintain them, can be quite a difficult thing to do. And learning how to do that confidently and well in a way that doesn't upset people too much is a balancing act. Those are some of my thoughts.
I think you've really nailed something there with that sort of symbiotic relationship between power and anxiety. Obviously not all forms of anxiety, many forms of anxiety are entirely unrelated to that. But I think within, certainly within an established church like the Church of England, that relationship between power and anxiety is just, breaking that down is such a key task, and it's such a relentless task, to be honest. And, every time you think you might be getting somewhere with it, it jumps back. And it's and one of the huge influences on both me and Al is Anthony Reddy, and Anthony's work on the ways in which a white supremacist form of Christianity is entangled in the life of the church, and how to break that grip is huge. It's really related to what you're saying about power, and it's so insidious. It just works its way in so many ways. I think it's and I think that thing about expectations as well, that's a really helpful observation that I think I've certainly experienced, and Al, I know you have experienced as well, of that thing of other people expecting you to hold on to power that they see as the power that belongs to the vicar, or whatever. It's stepping out of that space is quite hard, and I think is only possible when you are willing for that space to become wilded in whatever way it is. It's difficult, isn't it? It's all very entangled. But I guess one of the things that we're wanting to say about anxiety, about that sort of power related anxiety, is that yes, it is symbiotic and it does go round in a circle. And so the only way to kind of break out of it is to refuse at some point that loop. And one of the words we use about that is betrayal. Actually, is that we are called, I think, to betray some of those systems of power that prop up our privilege and our expectation of power, and other people's expectation of our power. Al, do you want to chip in?
I think I just wanted to add something about territory to that, that actually a lot of a lot of the anxiety is also tied up in defending or maintaining spaces that we see as our territory, and so often the imagination of church is connected to that sense of territory, and you know, a worry institutionally that kind of, you know, well, if we're not around anymore, what, you know, what will not happen, and I think one of the gifts that we discovered along the way in that image of the ecotone, of those edge spaces, is that actually those edge spaces run everywhere. And if we choose to inhabit the ecotones rather than focus on maintaining our territory, actually our whole approach to, you know, what needs controlling or doesn't, gets shifted quite radically. So yeah, I think it's something about how we imagine what we're responsible for as well.
Yeah, I think that thing about responsibility, actually, if I can just pick up on that for a moment, one of the metaphors, well, one of the lenses that we use in the epilogue about this is talking about trustworthiness. And what does it mean for the church to be trustworthy? And I think one of the things that we saw in those early days of the pandemic was some churches and some church leaders having as their primary messaging, it's okay, we can still do everything. It's okay, we can do what we did before. We're still going to have daily mass, or we're still going to have a big charismatic praise service, or we're still going to have whatever it is that was important to that church. We can still do it. It's okay. The show's on the road. We've got this. And that is a form of trustworthiness. You know, that sort of dependability of it's okay, we're still doing it, the show must go on. You know. But what we were wanting to explore is how different that is from the form of trustworthiness that we were trying to explore at that point at Hodge Hill, which is about honestly reflecting the present reality in the way that we're functioning. So being honest in our conversations about what we can and can't do and how we might proceed and what is the priority, but also being honest in the way that our liturgy and our worship reflects our present reality. And I think some of those concepts like trust and responsibility are really slippery, and can be seen in different ways depending how we think power functions, and how we're using power, what kind of power we're talking about. One of my big influences about power is a book by Anna Mercedes called Power For, where she talks about the difference between power over, which is that sort of dominating power of I'm in charge and I'm saying what goes, power with, which is a much more kind of mutually and equally distributed power, and then power for, which is power that moves in a direction. And in her case, she's talking about, she's writing from a feminist standpoint, and she's talking about power that moves in a direction of liberation for women and all who are oppressed by patriarchy. But it could be any kind of a direction. And I think direction rather than end point. And that's one of the distinctions that we draw out in the book quite a lot as well. So one of the things we talk about is tactics rather than strategy. And that's about setting a direction of travel, a mutually agreed direction of travel, rather than saying, well, that's where we're going to get to. Which I think leaves us much more open to seeing interruption then, not as something which is sort of thwarting us, but as something which is maybe changing our direction a bit, or maybe just incorporating along the way. Or whereas I think if we've already decided where we think we're going, anything that we perceive as derailing that becomes a threat, and that makes us very anxious if we feel threatened.
Yeah, I appreciate when you're talking about power and how that keeps coming up. I guess when you're talking about different situations of power, over, with, and for, the one that I'm thinking of is like, well, what about power from? Like, where is your empowerment coming from? And how people of faith think about that in terms of human and divine power and that relationship. But I don't know if you want to jump on that. That's just what came into my mind. I see Jody is like getting excited about that maybe. But does anyone else have, I think we've got about 20 minutes. I want to honor people's time. So if anyone else has maybe a last comment or question, and then I'd like to spend at least the last several minutes with Ruth and Al, maybe reflecting from our conversation or from what they'd like to bring from the book about next steps and maybe practical thoughts on what we can do with what we're learning. So anyone want to get maybe a last thought, last question? Jody? Oh, I thought I saw you come off mute.
Yeah. Well, it's my thought when you asked where does power come from, and I thought, well, of course, our power probably should be coming from God, but we kind of tend to source our power in the institution of the church, and that's probably not great. That was why I did that.
That's often my reaction to conversations about power in the church too.
Yeah, I saw your hand. Did you have a comment?
Yes, and what Jody says triggered in my head, that idea that Ruth and Al write about, that we so often feel that we then have that power from God and are Jesus for everybody else, instead of being interrupted by others.
And I think, obviously, if we begin to ask questions about power as it's exercised in the world and where God fits into it, the inevitable next question is, well, what kind of gods and what kind of power do we attribute to God's kind of power works in what way? And obviously, historically, God has often been the kind of the top of the hierarchy of a vertical form of power, and that precisely is the source of many of our problems in thinking about power and exercising it, and continues to be. I think every time any of us in a church pray to that kind of patriarchal God, we reinforce those kind of dangerous forms of patriarchal and hierarchical power within our relationships, whether we intend to or not. So that's one of the big issues. I think, again, one of the journeys that I really found myself going on in the writing of the book with Ruth was thinking through more articulately what our theology of the Holy Spirit was, and being able to articulate. And I think this is profoundly important for our pneumatology, our theologies of the Spirit. But obviously, actually, if we start there, it then has to permeate our theology of the Trinity and theology of the other persons of the Trinity. But I think our pneumatology is a starting point for rethinking power, where we see God active and in what kind of ways, just feels a really important question for our times. And I think one of the things that shifted in me over the last few years is that I used to think the primary question for theological reflection is, where is God in this situation? But now for me, the primary question for theological reflection is, how is God present or active in this situation? What kind of qualities of God are being manifest here? Because I think, you know, that gets us a little further into this question of what kind of God are we imagining or praying to or working with.
Yeah, and I think for me this almost loops back to where we were discussing quite near the beginning of today's session about that idea of keeping things a bit open-ended, of not sort of foreclosing the possibilities. And one of the things that I think that sort of regular, I'm going to use the word discipline actually. It's that sort of regular discipline of saying, well, what are the possibilities I haven't imagined here? What is there that's more than what I can perceive? I think that sort of, it forms our theological imaginations in ways which enable us to say, it doesn't have to be like this. And I, you know, when we imagine that what we name in the book as the kingdom of God, that sort of realm of God's being in the world, I think it doesn't have to be like this is one of those really foundational statements of what that looks like. That's what Jesus is saying in the Beatitudes, in the parables. It doesn't have to be like this. And very often, particularly in our conceptions of things like power, that's actually quite a hard imaginative leap, because our culture within and beyond the church is so ingrained in, it does have to be like this. Somebody has to be in charge. One of the delights and joys for me of my time at Hodge Hill, and one of the things that characterises events at Hodge Hill, is you never have any idea who's in charge. It's just not clear, and that's because nobody is in that sort of hierarchical sense. And I think for me, that's one of the really, it's probably a little bit of a roundabout way, but it's one of the ways in which that embodied hope happens in Hodge Hill, is that by not having people in charge of things, by being able to go to an event and not feel like a guest because it doesn't feel like somebody else is in charge, that for me is an embodiment of that hope that it doesn't have to be this way.
Linda, did I see a hand from you?
You didn't?
Oh,
No.
okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did eat a digestive biscuit. It could have been that.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, so Ruth and Al, when you're making that comment about, oh, sorry, thought I saw it again. Comment about not being in charge and not worrying about someone being in charge. I do, like, first of all, does anyone, I don't want to steal the last comment, speaking of giving people space, but does anyone have another comment or question before we kind of, okay. It's like, I'm thinking of a lot of language around pastors, and even the term pastor about being a shepherd and leading the flock. And I was wondering if you might have any thoughts on that kind of language in terms of the discussion we've just been having.
I think, so there is a chapter in the book where we talk about, in a very sort of Anglican way, but hopefully some of it is generalizable elsewhere, about orders of ministry, and try to do something that subverts that kind of idea of ministry as hierarchical, as sort of bishops, priests, deacons, lay people, the rest of the world. You know, we really want to subvert that. And one of the, I don't think that the metaphor of pastor is a useless one at all, but I think it's one of many. You know, one of many metaphors that we can use around ministry, and it's really important to keep using a variety of metaphors, and to be attentive that those metaphors are not all about a hierarchical kind of being in charge. So one of the metaphors that I really love is the metaphor which is in the Church of England's ordination service of the sentinel watcher, the one who watches, the one. And one of the ways that we've developed that in Being Interrupted is in the idea of priests as story gatherers, as the ones who hear, the ones who are attentive and who gather those stories. And I think that's a sort of subversion of the idea of pastoring as a kind of priests as ones who tell the stories. Very often we will want, and quite where you take that in terms of how you reimagine what preaching might mean or look like is still quite an open question for both of us. We've had some little experiments with what it means to preach interrupted, but we're still working on that, I think. It's quite an open-ended question still, but I think that diversity of ways of thinking about it is really important.
Great. And sorry, I didn't know if you had something. Were you going to hop in there, Al? We have one comment from John Falcone. I don't know if you use it in the book, but Tom Groom, who's a religious educator in the US, talks about holy order versus unholy order rather than holy orders, focusing on rank, which is interesting. And I don't know if you wanted to reflect on that. And then in light of you mentioning that this is always an ongoing and open conversation, maybe in our last 8 or 9 minutes or so, maybe reflect on some takeaways, maybe some practical, like what do we do now that we've been talking? What can we bring back to our communities?
I would love to hear from others what maybe has been sparked for you in terms of something you might take away and either think on further or do differently or ponder more.
I found this really invigorating and kind of encouraging this morning, and thinking about I've got that unusual role of being, in addition to my red letter thing, being a pastor, but I'm a lay minister in the Methodist Church. So I'm not kind of steeped in these kind of power, the kind of hierarchy thing. And sometimes it's quite useful to just be a bit clueless because I just kind of go about things. But I guess one of the things that's been really important to me, I think, in leading, but also in my personal discipleship, is not curating who I take input from as carefully. It's like somebody's feedback and comments about how things can change or be better can come from anywhere. And I guess the more you kind of demonstrate that everybody is co-creating, the more that becomes an environment where that feels possible all the time. And that includes being like, oh, I didn't do this very well, or, oh, that didn't work, did it? Let's learn from that and try something else. Or saying you're sorry if you did something wrong. All that kind of stuff in public, I think, is quite important, as well as having multiple voices and not always. I love was thinking about Amy Jo Levine, who talks about the domesticated stories, which kind of like that we need to not domesticate our versions of events, or domesticate Jesus stories, and how much that fits into what you're talking about, and how we in church also, I think, like telling stories that maybe sometimes contradict each other and owning it and being like, we're figuring things out. We don't all have to agree, because that creates some freedom for us to all learn and maybe change our minds, like normalizing that. So anyway, this is just, that's kind of what I was thinking about this morning, and how I feel really encouraged, like we're kind of like on the same journey together with how we approach all this stuff. And it's great.
Yeah, I love that, Danielle. I love what you said, particularly the thing that really grabbed me, and you said a lot of really helpful stuff there, but the thing that really grabbed me was that thing about not curating who whose voice we allow to influence us. I think it's so easy to subconsciously do that, particularly if you've been in the same place for a little while, to subconsciously think, oh, you know, those are the people with the good ideas, or those are the people who are kind of incisive and insightful about stuff. And I think one of the things for me is allowing ourselves to hear voices which might be expressing some of that input in ways that are not the ways that we would express it. Yeah.
That's so true. And it hurts, doesn't it? Sometimes it really does. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it hurts, and sometimes it's just really baffling. Sometimes it's just, I don't know what. I think it's very easy, particularly, it's easy to want to move away from the stuff that hurts, but it's also really easy to want to move away from the stuff we don't understand. I want to say, well, I don't understand what they're saying to me, so it doesn't have any worth. Whereas actually sitting with, well, I don't understand that, but you know, maybe I will, or maybe I can ask a question, or maybe I can ponder on it a bit further. Yeah, sitting with that discomfort, important stuff.
And I think time is so vital within that, isn't it? That actually, when we discover that actually we have an abundance of time rather than that time is limited and we must make a decision now, or we must kind of sift out what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong now. Actually, that possibility, like you say, Ruth, of sitting with it, of allowing even the stuff that doesn't make sense and is uncomfortable to just stay with it until it begins to give us the gifts that it needs to give us.
Linda, go ahead. I saw your hand.
Yeah, just talking of time, it would have been good if I had read this book 33 years ago, if you've been here. This is absolute music to my ears, all of this. I was lent the book by someone, I think you might know, Val Barron, who's a friend of mine. And because 33 years ago, when my father died, and I was so broken, I didn't know I was broken. I went to a Christian festival where I think probably naively I thought it would bring my dad back, really, but certainly my pain would go. And I heard so many testimonies, going back to what Faith said, that were all sewn up and everything was just right because whoever had died was with the Lord. And I absolutely didn't feel any of that. And it was just so refreshing to hear that the problem is really we think we have to tie these testimonies off. And so refreshing to hear that absolutely not. So I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda.
Well, this is great. So, Faith, thank you so much for facilitating this, and Al and Ruth for just all of your wisdom today. I really, really love the conversation and everybody's contributions to it. I feel quite excited now. So thanks for being part of this, everyone. And I'm going to upload this just after. So if you want to share it around, you can do that. Just also to mention quickly, I put a link in the chat. Our next book club discussion picks up on some of these themes again, with Jarrell Robinson Brown talking about his book, Black, Gay, British, Christian, Queer, Church, and the Famine of Grace. I'm really excited about that. So that's on the 6th of November. And you'd be very welcome to join us and come along and be part of the conversation. So great, thank you all, and thanks to Al and to Ruth, and we'll end it there. And to Faith. Just gonna stop the recording.